Greetings, dear listeners. Our guest today is Sean MONAHAN, one of the most perceptive cultural forecasters of our time. If you've ever used the term normcore, or if you've heard someone talk about a vibe shift, you've been influenced by Sean. And if you haven't heard those terms, then you're about to learn a lot about American culture in this episode. Sean is a writer, a trend forecaster, and a brand consultant whose Substack, 8Ball, is an oracle of cultural insight. Before we get started, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paid subscriber if you're not one yet. You'll get access to, among other things, the full conversation, as well as other subscriber-only benefits. And don't forget to give us a like and review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show.
So we have a very special treat today. We have Sean MONAHAN with us, and not to sound too immodest about what you've done, Sean, but you're sort of the god of internet trends. In a way.
I don't know.
In a way.
I don't know if I'd use that word, but I have a very good track record. That's true.
Yeah, you do. And you coined a term that I think a lot of us use. We probably use it too much now. That term is vibe shift. And it's really spread everywhere. And people talk about vibes just in a way that they wouldn't have a couple years ago. So much so that my dad, after Kamala became the nominee over the summer,
Yep.
and my dad, who's not very into Democratic politics, was talking about the joy and the vibes. And so there's just something incredible about how these terms travel very quickly. One moment, no one's using them. The next moment, everyone's talking about
Well, I'll hold you off on that, though. I don't think they travel that quickly, because I wrote that original piece in 2021. So we're nearing kind of year 4 of me discussing the vibe shift. But this is kind of I guess maybe why I have a special touch with internet trends, is that I think they actually do take a little while to seed themselves outside of the core kind of niche audience that you have on Substack and Twitter.
Yeah, well, maybe just for a layman who's not really into the lingo, can you just explain to us a vibe shift and how you came up with the idea in the first place in 2021? Because presumably the idea didn't just fall from the sky. You had been following trends for many years by then.
Explain it to Shadi's dad. Yeah.
Yeah, to my dad.
I mean, it did fall out of the sky a little bit in that, for a little bit of background, I call myself a trend forecaster, but I'm also a writer, and as you know, writing doesn't bring in that much income, so I moonlight as a corporate consultant, talking to them about trends and internet culture, etc. And so talking about kind of shifts generally is usually how you package a trend for a corporate audience. And again, this is June 2021. So when I'm writing about it, we've kind of gone through 2020. We've had our year in review, where I don't know if people remember this, but literally every kind of year in review article from early 2021 just talked about vibes, because no one was quite sure how to discuss what happened culturally in 2020. Mostly because, the movie schedules got screwed up, film and television schedules got screwed up, a lot of things were moving around, people were consuming more of different things, and also I think everyone just felt really weird after that year. So I think people were struggling to put it into words. And vibes generally, I think, have become kind of had replaced the term aesthetic, maybe. People talked a lot about aesthetics in the late 2010s, and then they began to talk about vibes. I mean, generally with internet trends, you see people trying to make them more and more abstract because you're talking about things that are happening online instead of necessarily referring to like specific pieces of clothing or pieces of music or different consumer goods. Yeah, so in terms of vibes, I wrote that right when New York City was coming out of the pandemic. It was probably the weekend after the bars reopened, which you can imagine was, quite a different vibe from what Manhattan had
Yeah.
been for the last 18 months. And what I found also, to go back to like this kind of like vibes as a placeholder for not being really sure what we're talking about, there had been a lot of cultural change in that time period. And again, like kind of like putting your kind of COVID hat back on. I think for a lot of people, I mean, I'm a millennial. I'm 38 years old. I definitely was one of those people who felt like you went into the pandemic still feeling kind of like a young person, and exited the pandemic being like, no, you're definitely an adult now. Um, and so part of that was also, kind of coming back out into the world and discovering that there had been this kind of generational change, and that a lot of the cultural references that cool downtown people had before the pandemic had all changed rather rapidly. And I think especially because COVID had this weird time distortion effect, and that some people really were kind of like getting through it by pretending that time wasn't passing while they were in quarantine or lockdown, was also kind of the inspiration behind it.
So vibes aren't really meant to be precise. They're meant to evoke an aura, a feeling, something undefinable.
I think there's a general cultural atmosphere.
I think that you have people saying, well, because you can't measure vibes, because it's so subjective and it's just about what someone is feeling in this indefinable way, that it's not actually a good way of analyzing culture or politics. It's almost like a cop-out.
Yeah, I mean, the original thing I wrote, though, I had like some specific kind of things that I was predicting that I think mostly came true. And so talking about a vibe shift to me was also kind of like, how do you layer up a bunch of disparate things that do come together to have kind of like a different affect or a different feeling to culture, but you could kind of discuss each one individually as a trend in and of itself. And those were like, the 2000s nostalgia that I think maybe is on its way out a little bit, but certainly was new in 2021. That became called like indie sleaze maybe a month later. Party photography, low-rise jeans, different cuts to denim, generally, cami tops. I don't know. There's a lot of like kind of niche stuff, but you know it when you see it. I think you can you can do trends with like making like a lot long. Well, I mean, I think like Euphoria was kind of early to this. It was a very different way of dressing than maybe
Did you
previously.
watch Euphoria, Shadi?
Yeah, I did. Season 1, it's excellent. It's very dark, obviously.
Excellent.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
can include a link to the show in the show notes for those of you who want a kind of really intense viewing experience, but probably not for moms and dads. It's got a lot of bad things happening, drugs and sex and so forth.
Stay
Yeah.
safe, parents.
Very edgy. One of the last edgy teen shows out there. But so there was that. There was this return to 2000s nostalgia. There was like a renewed interest in books and readings, which I don't know if you guys have noticed. There's like been a flurry of articles in the Times about these kind of like niche, small run magazine readings in Lower Manhattan, especially.
Yeah.
And you see them in Los Angeles too. That like, wokeness or like kind of performative progressivism on Instagram, etc., was going to go out of fashion, which is kind of, I think, the biggest. Initially, no one talked about that element of it, and now I think that's all anyone
Everyone's
talks about.
talking about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so all of these examples totally make sense to me. What are the components of a vibe? Like if you not
Yeah.
like a specific vibe, but a vibe generally. Is it like an age group, a location, like artifacts? Like what goes into creating a vibe? Or when you say vibe, what does it contain?
I think generally vibe is kind of like the synthetic feeling that kind of happens above, as you're saying, all these kind of literal components. So on one level, you have the things that I'm kind of talking about here, which are just like the actual cultural consumer output. Like, what clothing are people buying? What music are they listening to? What movies are they watching? I think that kind of together can give a specific moment a certain feeling. But then below that, like, you're correct. There are groups of people doing things in specific places. I do think that, like, trends, when they are good, tell the same kind of story that, like, a basic news article does. They have a who, what, where, when, and why. Because they do have to start somewhere, even if that's online, right? They have to start with certain people doing certain things that are new, and then those things being adopted. And really kind of the role of a trend forecaster or a vibe shift predictor
Vibe
is,
shift god.
is to, like, have a good gut feeling about what things actually have legs with a broader audience. Because I'm talking about, like, a very niche scenes in Los Angeles and downtown Manhattan, which are always kind of the places where a lot of new things start. But obviously most things that people are doing downtown or in the east side of LA don't actually have a broader cultural appeal.
Well, so I have a question about that, actually, and you kind of hinted at this a little bit earlier, that especially post-COVID, it kind of seemed like the vibe was people had spent too much time, or not, well, to me it seemed like too much time, but maybe not to them, a lot of time online, and that was in part where the vibe was coming from. But but in, I would say, like, maybe, or I would guess, in the past, and maybe still in your telling, the vibe was what people were doing in real life, like what they were doing in downtown New York or, East LA. Like, are we moving to a time of online vibes coloring the offline world in a reversal of the past, or has it, like...
Yeah. I think absolutely. I mean, the one thing, like I said, I was in New York, it was the pandemic. There was also a lot of coverage about how people were breaking all the pandemic rules in New York, maybe more so than the rest of the country, which to me makes a lot of sense, because it's one thing, even in Los Angeles, to have to stay in your house for a year and a half. Like, you probably have a backyard, you have a lot more square footage. I don't know, a lot of the apartments that people have in New York might feel more like a prison cell if you have to stay inside. You have no outdoor space, like, you have, like, one window, maybe you live in a studio. I think that's a much bigger ask, and frankly is why people were breaking the pandemic rules earlier in New York City. I think a lot more people than at the time admitted, broke a lot of COVID rules. But there is, like, this general, like one thing is, like, the vibe shift I was definitely talking about a new, younger audience. I think, people hate talking about generational definitions because they're overly broad and they're stereotypical, and I think all those things are true. But at the same time, I do think younger people are slightly different than people in their 30s and grew up at a different historical moment. And so part of the reason why you see this kind of desire to make online scenes into real life scenes is because, well, one, there's a lot more power in actually knowing people in real life. I think you're just kind of missing a lot of aesthetic cues and interpersonal cues, and there are kind of limits to the kind of relationships that you can form if you have purely digital relationships or purely digital cultural scenes. And two, because it's become kind of, I think, there's become a status element to being able to do things in real life because American cities have become so expensive. It's, well, it's not like, I live in Los Angeles now, but I used to live in New York, and I feel like in the early 2010s, they were still post-industrial spaces. They were still kind of like cheap, untouched by gentrification areas in the city that were, like, relatively accessible to broke young people. It feels like the whole city itself has been much more rationalized. Same thing for Los Angeles. And just in general, the price of going out for food or going out for drinks, these kind of, like, general social activities has gone up. There aren't, like, $2 PBR nights in the Lower East Side anymore.
Oh,
PBR and buying a $30 martini.
So I wanted I want to dig into how certain cultural shifts happen. There's one that's been on my mind, and I just want to test it out with you and see what you think. because I found this to be quite striking that all of a sudden, after guys were wearing slim or even skinny jeans, and that was the dominant aesthetic for many years, all of a sudden you start seeing people wearing baggy and sometimes ridiculously baggy jeans. And I myself was caught off guard, and I started thinking to myself, well, how exactly did this happen? All of a sudden, some people start doing the same thing at the same time. But then, presumably in the beginning, no one was doing it, or only a couple people were doing it. So the question is, how do you go from a couple people waking up one day and being like, well, first of all, how are they coming up with this idea to wear baggy jeans going against what everyone else is doing? And then at some point, those few people become a critical mass. And that's the part that is really hard to measure or quantify or to figure out how exactly it happened, when it happened. So do you have like a grand theory of
Kind
how...
of.
Oh, great. Okay,
Tell us,
perfect.
please.
I mean, at least for denim, some of this is like, anecdote. I rely heavily on anecdote because you're talking about like, really small groups of people doing things. But like you bring up skinny jeans. Once upon a time, I was an early skinny jean adopter. And back in, say, 2006, you couldn't buy them, right? Like, you had to have a friend with a sewing machine to make your pants into skinny jeans. And this was clearly part of, like, a kind of, like, 80s nostalgia that you had in the mid-2000s. And also because this was the kind of incipient era of hipsters, so people were trying to differentiate themselves from, like, more mass consumer audience. But then, like, what translates that to a broader audience is, someone actually making a commercially available product. So, in my mind, for the skinny jeans kind of mass adoption, it starts with that Swedish brand Cheap Mondays that they sold at Urban Outfitters. And suddenly you didn't need a friend.
I'm not cool enough to know what that is. Or that's a deep cut right there.
I think Christine is nodding. I think she remembers.
I
Christine
do.
knows.
I think a lot about pants, honestly.
Yeah. But then you have this pendulum swing that happens, which is that you hit like this kind of saturation point where everyone wears skinny jeans, your mom wears skinny jeans, and then you have young people who want to differentiate themselves from the kind of preceding generations. And I think that's kind of why you see a lot of pendulum swings between baggy fit to skinny fit. Because wearing skinny jeans in the 2000s was very transgressive, you were really going against the grain of what everyone else was wearing. And that's kind of the same thing with the baggier fits right now. And we'll probably see a pendulum swing back.
Yeah.
Like I saw a very funny video of this band, sorry.
Oh, go for it.
When they were like being asked what they were wearing. And they said and they were wearing skinny jeans. Because I think there's like kind of like a small group of people who started to transition back across the line once again. But they said that they bought them from Bosnia because they couldn't find any good skinny jeans in the United States anymore.
Wow.
And they said they weren't going to tell anyone where they bought them, which feels very 2000s to me in and of itself. Like
Yeah,
we're going to
totally.
gatekeep our skinny jeans source in Bosnia.
It's from this vintage store. You wouldn't have heard of it. It's in
You wouldn't know it's
Bosnia.
in Bosnia.
But I guess that still leaves open the question of how do you go from those few people to the critical mass? Because that part seems to actually be kind of sudden to me. Like, or
Yeah.
maybe because I'm not tracking it as closely, so I just noticed it one day. Like, oh, when I go to New York now, I see baggy jeans everywhere. When just like maybe a year ago, it wasn't that way. But you have to have normies adopting what the few trendsetters are boldly doing on their own, and so that's the part that I always wonder about.
Well, I think there's a reason why I keep coming back to New York and LA, and that's also because there's, a high degree of media saturation in these cities. So there are people who both work in fashion who live in these places. There are people who cover fashion for media outlets. And those two things together, I think, are how you get this kind of mass uptake. But usually, like, with fashion stuff, you're going through, like, a couple of cycles, right? First you have, like, the luxury houses doing it. And then and this is kind of, like, there's a lot of parallels between fashion and tech, actually. Because both tend to do things in a luxury environment because they're artisanal and they're niche, and then after it proves its popularity with less price conscious, let's say, slice of society, you see people start to produce it on a mass scale. And then it kind of diffuses out from there.
Shadi, there's actually this great book about this, and Sean, maybe you've already read this, but W. David Marks's Status and Culture.
No, I haven't, huh?
I've read some of it, but
Yeah.
it's good.
It's dense, but it talks about like the cycle of trends as markers of status, and it does start with sort of early adopter, rebel, often like out culture groups, and then it's often like adopted by sort of leaders who are often luxury buyers or sort of seen people who want to differentiate themselves from the masses. But I think the point that you make, Sean, that's really important is that this happens in sort of like coverage saturated places. So like even if there was like a trend happening among teens in Oklahoma or whatever, like shout out to teens in Oklahoma, but unfortunately the New York Times is not based in Oklahoma. So that's not a trend that would like suddenly become mainstream or become the vibe. But like a small trend that
Sometimes,
happens
though.
in sometimes, well, with the internet, I think that's maybe changing a lot actually.
Well, maybe do you remember Saddle Creek Records? The
Yes.
Bright Eyes emo era of music?
I
Like that
that's
came out of Nebraska, I believe. But
yeah.
it did transit to, a place that has more media coverage before it
Yeah.
kind of, I think, went super mass.
And straight edge, I mean, straight edge and like screamo, that like DC and still kind of bigger than those places. But yeah, I guess the internet is democratizing some of these sort of small time trends. And I'll put a link to the book
Yeah.
in the show notes because it's like a really interesting resource. But I
Yeah.
wonder if you could talk a little bit about that actually. I mean, this democratization of the vibe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always kind of ambivalent about it because I agree with you that the internet has democratized things. But then, as you said, David W. Marks's book is about status competition through cultural choices. And I think that's why you always end up with like these superstar cities being kind of the linchpin in terms of, mass adoption. But yeah, I think it's tricky because like when we're talking about Saddle Creek Records, this is like also kind of the beginning of the internet democratizing things. It's like the MySpace era. So the internet becomes kind of like that missing media conduit, but I do think it tends to still have to like grow into something real in an actual place to be kind of coverable, and also to prove that it's not just purely digital. Because I think this is kind of like passing a little bit, but do you remember like when people would talk about cottage core?
Yes, all the cores. Yeah,
Yeah, and I think a lot of like there's this huge resource called like Wiki Aesthetics, and
yeah,
it's kind of the word core applied to every single possible thing you could imagine. I just remember there's like one entry called like they're like it's trauma core, and it's just like it looks like a Courtney Love album cover, like like a broken doll or something in a kind of dirty
yeah.
bedroom.
Transact Nation core. Yeah,
Yeah, and I'm like I don't really know that this is like the same as some of these other cultural movements because it feels more like you're just making images to put online. So that doesn't really have like a consumer leg to it. I mean, this is kind of always like the dirtiness of being a trend forecaster is that you feel like you're breaking other people's toys sometimes because you have these small niche cultural moments happening and you are kind of like the baddie who's coming in and reporting on it, which does tend to like ruin things oftentimes. Although I think
yeah.
things have their own kind of clock set on them, anyways. Most kind of cultural scenes don't really last more than 5 years.
Inter.
Well, maybe
I think
that's
people
a
just
way.
age out. Also by that point, you have a certain level of media saturation and interest, and they've kind of picked the winners and the losers. Because even though people say that they're doing all these things for fully earnest reasons, people want to be successful. Creative people want to get paid to do their craft or make their art. And, there's kind of a clock ticking on how long you can be an ingenue before you transition that to a more traditional career.
Well, maybe the 5-year number gets us into, I think, how how to look at the latest cultural shift. And I think it's a pretty profound one that sort of everyone's talking about and debating what does this latest vibe shift mean, where I guess we can date it to January 2025. So pretty recently.
Yeah, for mass adoption, right?
Where, yeah, mass adoption, where, it's really striking that if we had talked 2 or 3 years ago, I think most of us would have said that the liberal left is so culturally dominant, and that you have most mainstream institutions, arts, culture, academia, mainstream media are really in this woke phase. Everyone's talking about or wanting to do DEI, even tech companies, and that's where the term woke capitalism emerged from. And it seemed like it was so all encapsulating that it was stifling for so many of us. And, some of us tried to fight back, and we were the voices saying, like, we're not going to be on board with this, but it was sometimes a lonely place to be. And then now all of a sudden you see, I go to parties now, just one last night actually, where it's mostly left of center people, and they're all like, "Oh yeah, DEI and the woke stuff, it went so far. The trans stuff, wow, Democrats really pushed that aggressively, and it alienated everyone." But they weren't saying that 2 or 3 years ago. So there's also something here about how permission structures work. That if there's a symbolic shift, and they see someone like Donald Trump and the Republicans in power, and they're the ones who are saying woke is done and we're dismantling DEI, then everyone sort of gets the message that now you're allowed to talk about this and you're not going to suffer career or political consequences. So it wasn't a very sudden shift, but it feels sudden. It was building up over the last couple years, but it feels like it just exploded in the last couple months. So how do you sort of assess all of that?
So first of all, when I wrote the vibe shift piece, I was living in what people have called Dime Square, which is basically
Famous.
like a meme. It's like a meme neighborhood. It doesn't really even exist. It's Chinatown. It's Chinatown in New York. And part of what people were complaining about, there were a couple of like media pieces, were about all these young people who were being irreverent about progressive politics. I think a lot of that started even before the pandemic with the podcast Red Scare, which has now been around for, I think, almost a decade. I think they started getting their media coverage in like 2017. So they really kind of kicked that off. And what's interesting to me is that, like, you talk about permission structures, the first people who can kind of start complaining and throw off the yoke and be like, well, we're not going to abide by these speech codes, and we're going to say what we want. I'll also put in here that, like, I think probably the right-wingness of Dime Square is overstated, in that I think you find people with a lot of opinions, and the real difference was that people could just say right-wing stuff and not be immediately booted from the party. So that was the real distinction. But you do have kind of people working in, a traditional kind of avant-garde setting, and that's why they can do things that they wouldn't be allowed to do in Hollywood or in the mainstream publishing industry. And it can be supported partially by like these micropayment systems like Substack or Patreon. And so on the one hand, like, it starts from a very small place, as most interesting things do. And it starts with people who are not at the center of culture and are kind of at the edges, who have more freedom because they don't have a career to nuke yet. So that kind of that inhibiting fear, right, where people start to self-censor, which happens to everyone, I think, as they find success, right? Like, that's where kind of, even probably the reason why corporate America went along with DEI, etc., was not out of like some earnest desire to be progressive, but because corporations are inherently risk averse. So they saw it as a way to like avoid lawsuits. Anyways, but I think you saw this kind of spread partially just, and we saw this, right? Like, it was young people who shifted right towards Trump. And I think it's hard for progressives or Democrats to see themselves as the establishment. I think I wrote about this in the piece I put up about the counter elite, quote unquote. that I think progressives just don't want to admit that they are the establishment. That if you were 21, right, like all of the people that were authority figures in your life, your teachers, the content moderators on the platforms you liked, were all progressive identified or progressive leaning. And I think that's a big part of why we saw this rightward shift, right? Because Americans classically are always, rebelling against whatever authority figure they have, whether that's in a corny way or an earnest way or a real way. And so I think, like I was saying about the skinny jeans, right? Your teacher was like a millennial who was, into internet activism, into Instagram, woke Instagram diagrams. And she was wearing skinny jeans, and she was the one who told you what you couldn't say. So I think that kind of shift generationally makes a lot of sense then, when you see it as a rebellion against maybe overweening authority figures.
But what's striking is how weak the liberal left seems. Like, after all the confidence and basically them imposing their cultural norms top down in a kind of authoritarian way, it's just striking to me how weak that all seems right now.
Yeah.
And
Well-
it's almost like they're feckless, and they're not even putting up much of a resistance. Like, there's very few people who are saying, well, actually, let's keep DEI alive. And
Yeah.
and it just like, where did all the, it could
Well,
mean that.
One, I don't think that many people were ever earnestly woke or progressive in the first place.
Yeah.
There was like this study that came out right after Trump was elected, about political tribes in America, and when you looked at it, you found that like people who identified as progressive activists or even mainstream liberals as kind of like the squishier version of that, only made up like 20% of the population. And so I think the kind of total full spectrum dominance was not necessarily because people's opinions changed that much, even though people's opinions did change, but like, I think we can see how kind of feckless public opinion is, the fact that it's changed so quickly back in the other direction. But that, we had this new kind of cultural paradigm where people weren't talking to each other in real life. They were talking over digital platforms where everything's recorded. And whenever they said something that was unpopular, it was recorded forever and they could get in trouble for it. Or even just, I think email culture, right? I went back to like, corporate risk aversion. Part of the reason why you email everything is to create a paper trail. So if anyone ever gets in trouble, they know who to blame. And all these things, I think, just had like the classic like chilling effect on free speech. And I think a lot of people were hiding their preferences for a long time. And then similar to what happened in a small, New York creative scene where once the dam broke, everyone kind of rushed out and immediately kind of threw off the... I mean, I feel like all the metaphors I'm using sound a little crazy, but, they threw off the censors and started saying what they really felt. And we have a little bit of that happening, too.
And
It's interesting to see kind of the pendulum already start swinging backward. I was looking at, like, the polling numbers for Elon Musk especially. He really seems like he's become the focal point for dissatisfaction already with the Trump administration.
Well, so two things I would say to that. I guess like part of, I think you're totally right at pointing out the chilling effect and how that might have actually made people's preferences for sort of the progressive performance seem stronger than they were. There's definitely that. But also I think some of the left's power or lack of power right now stems from exactly what you were saying earlier, Sean. Like, they're just not cool anymore. Like, you have power when people like think you're like hot and interesting and want to be like you. Like Barack Obama and his like reading list in 2008, he was young and hot. Now he's basically someone's granddad. He doesn't have the power to like inspire people to dress like him and like do the things that he
It was the
does.
Facebook election. I was in art school, it really did feel like
I was
a
in
new
college.
wave in politics. And I think millennials especially, one, have definitely been aping their parents. Their parents are usually baby boomers, so they grew up kind of inculcated in this like post-hippie to yuppie pipeline. I think a lot of people's parents romanticized and probably exaggerated their participation in social movements in the 60s. So I think there's an element of that, right? In that, like, you have the echo boom of millennials kind of imitating what their parents did when they were younger. And then two, like you were saying, you know, I think it was young and cool, and millennials specifically, you know, this is kind of endlessly rehashed. Maybe have like a little bit of Peter Pan syndrome, you know, like when I was talking about the vibe shift. Like, I do still think it's funny that I would have these conversations with my friends who are like, you know, in their early 30s, maybe, you know, early 30s 5 years ago, who would kind of have trouble thinking of themselves as the adults in the room, you know, and
Yeah.
some of that has to do with, like, you know, labor market scarring from the Great Recession and how expensive housing has gotten and people delaying family formation because of that, you know, kind of all these like sociological factors, but also just generally, again, I think baby boomers also have struggled with aging. So there are kind of like these generational echoes happening
Yeah,
that
like
also
we
inform this.
millennials still want to like think that they're young or that their movement
Hmm.
is young, but they're not that young. Like AOC is not that
No,
young actually at this
we're
point.
middle
And
aged.
yeah, and like they're just like not cool anymore. But interesting that you and so like maybe that's why they can't pick up the same amount of like following and like excitement around the cause that they used to. I mean, like for the moment, the
Yeah.
brief blip that Kamala Harris had over the summer when she was brat, like that was created by 20-year-olds who just like happened to latch on to Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
It wasn't like it didn't come from her because she's like too old to come up with that sort of
Of
thing.
course.
And like kind of to point actually to what you were saying about how Elon Musk has his popularity is like totally dropping right now. A thing that
Yeah.
I've noticed about him, not that I've noticed. I mean, this has been true for a long time. I'm
Yeah.
very anti-Musk. I'm just going to say that I expect like the Doge to infiltrate my finances at any moment. He's not that young, and he's just so uncool. Like he's so lame
Yeah.
as a
But all
person.
those
He's
cultural references are from like early internet meme culture
yeah,
that was
and
popular over a decade ago. You know, it's Doge is the dog meme from like I think from
right. He's not
2013. You know,
cool, and so it's like really easy to get tired of him. He's
it's
not.
dad. I mean, it's dad humor. It's
Yeah,
100% dad humor, and it really registers as that at this point.
yeah. So it's easy to get
Even like, you
frustrated
know,
with him.
the Pepe stuff and Keck and all, you know, it comes out of 4chan, which is, you know, I remember 4chan from high school.
Yeah, but so okay, so I'm gonna stay on this like what the right
Yeah.
wing vibe is right now because this is something that's super fascinating to me and that you've written about. You you recently coined a new vibe term, boom
Yeah.
boom, right?
Yeah.
Is that how you pronounce it? I'm thinking of like the boom
They're
boom
just going
room.
downhill in sophistication.
I know.
Um,
After
yeah,
the
I mean,
club.
partially.
Okay, well, explain what
this
that
occurred
is,
to
and
me.
then I'm gonna ask you
Yeah.
some questions about it.
So this occurred to me quite a while ago. I was having dinner with my brother at Decimo, which is like the tapas restaurant above the Standard in London, and yeah, I'm really
I know too
revealing
much.
myself
I'm
here.
sorry.
Yeah, and I don't know, you know, we were like having drinks, and it's kind of like this like sleazy, you know, nouveau riche environment with like techno music, and all the waiters are like from modeling agencies. And it occurred to me, I was like, this feels very like boom boom. It feels like what people want. Like people kind of want to exit the earnest political argument phase that we've been in for like 15, 20 years now. And especially for both millennials and Gen Z, you know, people want to make money, and it feels very like 80s. Again, to go back to like this, you know, baby boomer transition from the woo woo politically active 70s to, you know, I'm gonna work on Wall Street. I'm gonna have a suburban house. I'm gonna start caring about like buying, you know, Ralph Lauren clothes instead of I don't know, like hippie caftans. This was kind of like a big like meta conversation. Oh God,
How were they
I'm
justifying
blanking
it
on the name
though?
of the sitcom where the parents are ex hippies and Michael J. Fox is the
Yeah,
son,
yeah.
who loves Ronald Reagan. And it, to me,
Alex
like,
P.
that feels
Keaton.
very,
Yes.
yeah, exactly. Like, it feels like there's an element of that to this. Um, and
So
also, this something I've been seeing for a while is like a shift towards people liking more like structured classic clothes. Like I see a lot of young men in suits, worn to varying effect, as the menswear guy on Twitter would say.
yeah, so okay, but one of the things that's specific about this also, and that I've noticed, like there's the 80s, there's structured suiting, there's like sort of gaudy luxury, but there's also a meanness to it and a celebration. So like the ideal person is not actually just like Alex P. Keaton who loves Ronald Reagan, etc. It's the guy from American Psycho who
Yes,
like murders people, who's very bad. And there's sort of like
this
a,
is.
a cruelty that's involved in this new trend. Like where is that coming from? Or how do we explain that?
I mean, I think some of that is performative as well. In the same way that in the cultural dispensation of the 2010s, people were pretending to be more empathetic and more inclusive than they actually were. I think people are pretending to be more cruel and craven than they actually are too. But also, just the Patrick Bateman meme has been going on forever, and this is kind of one of these funny, like, I feel like on X on Twitter or whatever, people talk about media literacy, like the intention behind the book American Psycho and Mary Herron's adaptation with Christian Bale, which is what people kind of visually
Yeah.
reference, is that it's like an allegory about the evils of Wall Street. Like he's supposed to be
It's
the
supposed to be
anti-hero.
bad. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and Mary Harron is like like a third wave feminist director. So the intentions behind this were not to valorize sociopathy,
But
but
yeah,
it
her
ended up
in
doing it.
yeah, but I
But
mean that's
also,
kind
he
of the
kills
thing.
people.
Yeah, her
Yeah.
the intentions like even in the 80s, sort of like Gordon Gekko was kind of a bad guy, but everyone loved him. And it seems sort of in this moment, I mean, I'm also thinking of sort of other non Wall Street manifestations of this, the fascination with like Bronze Age pervert and like all of these people who are sort of objectively amoral or perhaps immoral and just like not good. And like
Yeah.
identifiably not. But
Well,
like,
I think we're in a moment right now where we don't have what I would call like a coherent elite. And in my mind that means like a group of people that have social capital, cultural capital, and financial capital. And that it's kind of like a three-legged stool where each props up the other. And the last time we had that was really before the financial crash. Right? Like the finance industry had a lot of money. They were very traditional in how they used it to support like philanthropic initiatives and join the art world and become patrons of the arts. And I think like tech really didn't want this kind of like traditional model of what elites do to be real, because they're all libertarians. But I think we're finding that it is very real, that you do need kind of all three, this trifecta, to actually like right now, like Elon Musk is the richest person in the world, but he's dressing like Mike Tyson or something at CPAC, and so it's like he has a lot of financial capital via Doge in terms of like redesigning how institutions work. He has social capital, but he still doesn't have cultural capital because he's doing dad humor and his clothes are ill-fitting, and that's definitely like a line of attack on him, which just kind of goes to prove that these things are real and influence how people perceive you and whether they want to emulate you. And so I think with that kind of vagueness, that's kind of part of why people have gravitated towards money. I mean, I think like when I first wrote about Boom Boom, one of the things I said was that like you look at some polling amongst young people on what they value, and the top thing is just money. So social participation is down, religion is down. Like, how do you define success? It used to be like, having a family, being a participant in your community. All these things were kind of more balanced out with, again, like, the U.S. is pretty hyper-capitalist, and even people who say they don't like financial success, revealed preference would say otherwise. But now people will just say, no, it's just the money. And
But
I
Sean,
think
if
that's,
Sean,
Sorry.
I mean, what's your sense of how people are justifying this move to a kind of cruel, mean, less?
That's it for part one, dear listeners. There's a lot more where that came from. If you're not yet a paying subscriber, please head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and become one. Help support our work. Hope to see you in the bonus.